At the same time outside the magic tower, many students along with the guest nobles had arrived to see Andreas, but as they waited for a long time, someone questioned what exactly was going on there as Andreas still had not come out for hours. Among the students, Diane Alvin was also present there, who kept glancing all around as she felt worried about the whole situation. Diane then exclaimed, "Oh dear," and began wondering how her father was going to have a hard time explaining that to the nobles. Meanwhile, Vivien arrived and spotted Diane from afar. Vivien then instantly appeared beside Diane and pointed out that Andreas had still not come out. Meanwhile, Diane, who had not expected Vivien's sudden appearance, opened her mouth wide open in shock. Diane then maintained that her composer called for Vivien and asked her if she was back, to which Vivien just responded with a mum and asked Diane what had happened to Andreas. Diane then told Vivien that the professors were looking into it, but informed her that they had been at it for hours. Diane then shifted the topic and asked her why she looked so ragged. Diane then, looking at Vivien's worn-out gloves, began to wonder what she had been doing for the past few days to look like that. Diane then began reminiscing about their last meeting, where she asked Vivien where she was going, to which Vivien had responded with a single word, training, which made Dean realize what Vivien had been doing all that time. Diane then, looking at the tired Vivien, questioned herself if she really had been training since then, and from the looks of it, she had not even been sleeping. Furthermore, putting her hands on her nose, she thought that she had not even taken a bath, which made her stink, affecting everyone around her to instantly close their nose. Suddenly, Vivien called for Diane and asked her if her father was a mage tower master, which startled Diane as she exclaimed, "Huh?" Vivien then, looking at the gate of the magic tower, told Diane to do something about it, to which Diane, with a puzzled expression, just responded with a no and told her that even if Vivien said so, she was just a student, while on the back of her mind, Diane thought how that was no time to be worried about her father. At the same time, inside the magic tower, after his giant summon destroyed a tower, Andreas began analyzing how only 2 towers were left, and that all 3 of them were left, but even though the odds were clearly in his favor, he still couldn't see himself winning. Andreas, then calling him an old fox, thought how whenever he got the chance, he would attack him and restrict Rudo's movement. So Andreas concluded, stating that this was probably the main reason for the failed attempts. At that very moment, Rudo, who was in front of the old man, attacked him but failed as the old man instantly vanished from where he was standing. The old man then appeared behind Timer and casted another spell of water prison, which made huge waves of water appear where Timer was. Simultaneously, the water prison became so overwhelming that it almost swallowed Timer entirely. Meanwhile, Andreas, who was dashing towards the opposite tower, turned towards Timer and thought how the old man went for Timer. So, without any hesitation, Andreas knew he had a slight chance to destroy the pillar in front of him, so he dashed towards the tower, claiming that he would break it. But suddenly a huge wave of water disrupted Andreas's plan and began to cover the pillar entirely. Andreas, then glancing at the water that was covering the tower, questioned himself if that was the water shield. Abruptly, the voice of the old man could be heard, where he reached out his hands to activate another magic spell, while insulting Andreas by calling him a shame. At the same time, Andreas had already noticed the old man preparing his spell. So, calling him an old fart, Andreas immediately called out for Nick. Andreas calling Nickel was not something the old man had expected, but was rather intrigued as he glanced towards Nickel. Meanwhile, Nickel, with determination in his eyes, dashed towards one of the towers. Nickel then immediately swung his sword, which destroyed one of the towers that the old man was protecting. Witnessing the sudden turn of events, the old man pointed out that it was unexpected to summon back the undead he had withdrawn already. Meanwhile, Andreas was paying close attention to the old man and his words. Andreas then thought the way he was so relaxed could only mean one thing. Andreas, then standing confidently beside the pillar with the water shield, thought how breaking the remaining pillars wouldn't be the end of that. The old man, then looking at Andreas, who just suddenly stopped attacking, gave an annoyed expression and asked him if he was giving up, as he did have his chance. In response, Andreas, who was beside Rudo, told the old man no way, and that it was just that instead of that pillar. Andreas was far more interested in the clock behind him, which made the old man puzzled at the sudden claim Andreas made. Andreas, then holding his sword firmly in his hands, was determined to destroy the clock, while the old man looked at Andreas, trying to comprehend his plan. Suddenly, Nickel began to emit a strange blue aura as he took a battle stance, prepared to dash towards the clock. Andreas then swung his sword furiously towards the old man and told Nickel that he would leave that clock to him. Meanwhile, Modras, the old man, gave a cunning smile as he figured out what Andreas was trying to do. Witnessing this, Andreas was shocked as he questioned if Modras was really not going to stop him. Simultaneously, a huge magic shield like purple mana covered the clock that Nickel was heading towards. But that was not enough to make Nickel hesitate as he continued to dash towards the clock, determined to destroy it. Immediately, Nickel swung his sword, which sent a power slash of his sword towards the huge magical clock floating in the air. But to their surprise, the swing Nickel sent was deflected by the magic barrier that was covering the huge magical clock. Witnessing this, Andreas was also left in a state of confusion as he questioned himself if that really was a powerful shield. Meanwhile, the huge magical clock was covered by the huge magical barrier that Madras had already placed to protect the magical clock. Madras, who was standing behind Andreas, then began to laugh, which made Andreas turn towards Madras with a puzzled expression. Madras then told Andreas if he thought Madras would leave his magic's weak spot unprotected, while Andreas just kept staring at him silently. Madras then confidently told Andreas that he was not going to interfere in any way, so he should feel free to do whatever he wants. Hearing this, Andreas, with an annoyed expression, kept staring at Madras, while kept laughing and told him that only something at warlock level could damage the clock. Andreas then, with a calm expression, told Madras those words he just said and claimed to him that there were no takebacks, all right? Hearing what Andreas just said made Madras dumbfounded, as he had not expected Andreas to say such a thing. Suddenly, a system notification popped up which stated that the activation of Sloth on Sloth Phantom Nickel was being activated. Simultaneously, Nickel, who was on the ground covered with water, jumped up towards the clock as he felt immense powers surging inside him. Witnessing this, Andreas just gave a calm expression as this was what he had planned, but to Madras this was a huge surprise as he opened his eyes wide open in shock. Nickel then instantly reached the top and began channeling the power of Sloth, which made a mysterious red aura to be released by his body. Instantly, without any hesitation, Nickel then grabbed his sword with both his hands and arched back to launch his most powerful swing. Nickel then swung his sword with all of his strength to destroy the huge clock in one destructive slash. Simultaneously, a huge explosion happened where the clock was and where Nickel had launched his attack. The explosion was so immense that the shockwaves of the attack could also be felt outside of the tower where all the students, instructor, and nobles were waiting for Andreas. Everyone who was present, they were even more confused as to what was happening inside the tower. Among the nobles, a mysterious lady with a scar on her right also looked confused and questioned herself what was that just now. Meanwhile, Diane, with a look of concern, questioned if Andreas was still fighting, while Vivien just stood silently beside her. All Vivien could do at the moment was nothing more than wait for Andreas. So along with everyone present there, she kept staring at the huge magic tower waiting for Andreas's return. At the same time, inside the magic tower, the huge magical clock was in perfect shape as Madras had launched a counter to deflect Nickel's swing. Witnessing this, Andreas glanced towards Madras and told him that he thought Madras was not going to interfere. Meanwhile, Madras, who was still floating in the air after deflecting Nickel's attack towards the cloak, kept staring at Andreas in surprise. Madras then, with a puzzled expression, thought in the back of his mind how that power just now. Madras then immediately began to laugh, and told Andreas that the tower was still going to be used for exams next year, and if he destroys that clock, the whole tower would collapse. Hearing what Madras just said, Andreas was shocked and questioned him then why, to which Madras told him that he was going to let him pass if he destroyed the last pillar, but he was curious to see what Andreas might show him after he figured out the ruse. Madras then, with a calm expression, told Andreas that he didn't think he would actually try to destroy it, while Andreas pointed out that it could have turned into a real mess. Madras then, looking at Andreas, told him, well, his fighting style was certainly dangerous. However, he didn't build that tower to kill his students. Andreas instantly realized what he was about to do, which made him exclaim old man as he thought how if he had destroyed the tower there would be no reversing it. Madras then took out a locket and told Andreas, anyway, take this, which was his promised reward. This made Andreas stare at the locket. Andreas then spread his hand forward to receive the magic locket as he thought to himself that it was Silver Light's Glimmer, which was a necklace that had the effect of sharpening the wearer's mind. Andreas then, holding the locket near his face, thought how the magic locket was useful when using mana or aura. Andreas then thanked Madras very much for the reward and told him that this was a great item, but rather than him, that was for. But without letting Andreas complete, Madras told him how it was truly intriguing, which made Andreas question him, Madras then looked at Timer, one of Andreas's companies, pointed out a cat that would have reached perfection in life. Then looking at Rudo the giant, he pointed out how it was a mythical creature. Then looking at Nickel, pointed out that he even had an undead who could borrow and wield the power of a god. Madras then, with a calm expression, told Andreas that they were all the sort of research material that would have made him go crazy if he could have seen them during his lifetime, but the most intriguing of all was Modras then said that it was that body of Andreas. Hearing that made Andreas puzzle, as he had not expected Modras to say such a thing. Modras then said that it was as if a being from a distant mythical age, but instantly dismissed that and said perhaps something far older and more dangerous than that resides within his body, which made Andrea's eyes wide open in shock. After Modras said that, instantly silence filled the room as Andreas, along with his companions and Modras, just stood there. Andreas then immediately asked Modras if he could leave now, to which Modras said, "Oh, of course, he may leave." Modras then began emitting a mysterious golden mana as he told Andreas that in any case he shouldn't put too much trust in God. Modras, before he completely vanished, told Andreas to please guide that world in the right direction. Andreas then, witnessing all this, began to wonder how he certainly figured it all out, even though he was just a projection. Suddenly a system notification popped up stating the achievement he had received, which claimed that he was the one who was recognized by Modras. After all the things he had faced and persevered, Andreas knew what he had achieved and gave a slight smile. Andreas then, with a look of confidence, claimed that Modras Tower was cleared. As everybody was keenly looking at the tower, wondering how it had been hours since Andreas had been last seen live or had come out. Abruptly, out of the portal came Andreas, who, with a look of surprise on his face as he walked out of the tower, questioning with him. People yelled, "There he is," while the students that saw him were shocked as they couldn't believe it. Meanwhile, Diane had the same look on her face, while Vivien seemed shocked as well as happy to see Andreas come out safe. The people were still left in a state of shock as they had never witnessed someone like him, and was the first person who had broken Maximin's record. People were talking to themselves, saying how it was Andreas Cromwell. As he stood in front of everyone, he questioned himself how the reporters and the big shots were there, and was shocked to see such a huge crowd waiting for him. While the Highness, with her jaws and eyes wide open, tried to comprehend how Andreas made it and was continuously glaring onto him, while another character came near to her, asked to pardon, addressing her as Your Imperial Highness. Meanwhile, her bodyguard kept glancing at her. Seeing the person approach, her Highness, out of the blue, caught Andreas's attention as he tried to comprehend what her aim was. With her hand in front of her, she bowed down to her Highness, while her bodyguard bowed down with her as well. Introducing herself as the head of the Morhaime house, she stated that she had a proposal for Count Andreas, and asked her if she might yield her the chance. Meanwhile, her Highness was caught in a state of surprise, and with a nervous look on her face as sweat dripped, she exclaimed, "Sure, Lady Minas." Lady Minas further asked if she could do the same with others as well, and glanced back as her bodyguard coughed and addressed her as "My liege," and requested her to be more graceful. Meanwhile, while everyone was shocked and surprised, Diane questioned herself how anyone could even object to that, and with a surprised look on her face, she told with how she was behaving towards her Imperial Highness, she guessed all they could do was wait and see, while Vivien stated that Andreas had made it out safe and sound, which was more than enough for her. With one of her hands resting on her waist while raising another hand, she started to walk forward and told how Andreas had not only broken Maximin's record, but he also became the first person in history to conquer Modras's tower. Andreas was left in a state of awe while Lady Minas' bodyguard came together with her. Minas raised her hand, trying to congratulate Andreas by shaking his hand, and she quickly addressed Andreas Cromwell and told she wanted him to come under her wing. Andreas was left in a state of confusion as he looked at Minas' hand and thought how he had expected to be scouted by some high-ranking noble, but not from such a big one right from the start, and that too the head of the Morhaime family, one of the 4 Grand Dukes of the Empire, Minas Morhaime. With his hand resting in front of him, Andreas bowed down as he told Andreas Cromwell, greets her Highness Morhaime. Minas had a displeased look on her face seeing how Andreas reacted, but soon he asked for her forgiveness for not returning her handshake as his hands were unclean. Abruptly, her bodyguard yelled, "You are being disrespectful," but before he could finish his sentence, Minas raised her hand telling it's fine, which made him stand still in silence. With a serious look on his face, he thought to himself how she was the one who was being disrespectful. While her bodyguard didn't look pleased with how Andreas had reacted to his Highness, Minas quickly asked Andreas what he had decided to do after graduation, to which Andreas replied saying, "Not yet." Abruptly, Minas came close to Andreas and asked if he had a lover, which made him uncomfortable as he denied her question, telling no, he did not, and asked her back, why did she ask? She smiled as she exclaimed, "Great," and further asked her how about this Andreas and questioned him how about they form an alliance between the Morhaime and Cromwell houses. With a surprised look on his face, Andreas gazed at Minas as he asked her an alliance. While everyone were shocked and confused to what just Minas proposed, Minas told Andreas that if he agreed, She would protect him for his political rivals and promised him financial and military support until the Cromwell house is restored to its former glory. Andreas was left in a state of confusion and grinned as sweat dripped from his face as he thought to himself how that was too good to be true, and quickly asked what was in it for her to give him such a generous offer. Minas replied back stating that this won't be a mere alliance in words. It would be an alliance in blood between their two houses, and addressed Andreas Cromwell, telling she wanted him to marry her. Everybody who witnessed it was left in a state of shock. They couldn't comprehend how Lady Minas easily asked Andreas's hand for marriage all of a sudden, and with such a crowd watching it. Even Diane was left in a state of awe as she couldn't believe herself. But the one who was more shocked than everyone there was Vivien, who thought her whole world came crashing down on her as Lady Minas asked for her Mr. Fairy's hand. While everybody stood there, totally shocked to their senses, Minas asked Andreas why he was hesitating further, asking if it wasn't a good offer. Looking down towards her body, she asked Andreas if he was worried about their age difference. Feeling her stomach, she told how she thought she kept her body in check and told it was not like her stomach was sticking out, and further asked him if he found her unattractive as a woman. Meanwhile, her bodyguard blocking his mouth whispered to Minas, addressing her as "my liege," telling her to be more graceful. Andreas quickly replied as he disagreed with her, claiming she was attractive and beautiful. While Minas stared into Andreas, who on the back of his mind asked himself who would be stupid enough to answer a sudden offer of a political marriage right away. Abruptly, Vivien clenched her fist in anger and bit her lips tightly as she tried to repress her anger after hearing Minas ask for Andreas's hand. Meanwhile, Diane glanced sideways towards Vivien with a nervous look on her face, while Vivien quickly turned backwards and started to run from there. Abruptly, Diane also turned back, looked at her and yelled Vivien, but couldn't stop her. Looking at Vivien leave, she exclaimed, "Poor girl," and if she were in Andreas's position, it would be hard to refuse, given the state of his house. Meanwhile, Andreas apologized to Minas, claiming it was not a decision he could make right away, and kindly requested her to give him some time to think about it. He further exclaimed that he believed it was also customary at the academy to hear offers from other nobles as well. Keeping her hand on her chin, she glanced sideways, asking Andreas if he was going to weigh her against others. While her bodyguard had a displeased look on his face, Andreas thought to himself how accepting her offer so carelessly in front of many people may invite trouble for him. Minas gave a serious look on her face as she exclaimed, "Very well," telling she didn't like it, but since it was customary, he would give him time to think about it and claimed that he would soon learn that there was nothing better than his offer. Andreas quickly apologized to Minas if he had been unintentionally disrespectful, to which she replied saying she would forgive him if they had dinner together in the future. Closing his eyes, Andreas thanked Minas for understanding him and for her offer, but soon was caught in a state of surprise as someone addressed Andreas Cromwell. Resting her hand on her chest, it was a beautiful woman who introduced herself as the third Imperial princess, Michaela Rodlen, claiming she also had an offer for him. The next day, at the night faculty. As Andreas was walking through the hall of night faculty, he thought to himself how from one of the four great houses of the Empire to a member of the Imperial family, he didn't want to be in that kind of situation ever again. Abruptly, his chain of thoughts were disrupted as someone yelled, "Senior Andreas," and Andreas turned back to look who it was. To his surprise, it was Selena, who, with excitement in her face, asked Andreas if he was there to practice his swordsmanship. Bowing down with respect, Selena asked if he would mind training with her briefly if he had time, to which Andreas apologized, exclaiming sorry, and that he couldn't today for he was there to see Vivien. With nervousness on her eyes and sweat dripping from her face, she hesitatingly, pointing her hand backward, exclaimed if it is Senior Vivien. She had been at the training ground that was closed down after that incident a while ago since yesterday. As they reached the training facility, Andreas made his way towards Vivien. Abruptly, Selena, resting her hand on her head, said she took a quick peek, but the whole vibe was too scary for him, which made Andreas worried as he asked himself what was going on, as she really lost her mind, making him question himself, but why? Suddenly, a loud explosion occurred on the training ground, which startled Andreas for a while, and he glanced towards the explosion, trying to see what caused it. He was left in a state of shock as to what he was witnessing. It was none other than Vivien, who, with her sword raised up and her clothes ragged, was standing still as the fire emitted all around her. Looking at Vivien, who was fully concentrated and focused on her training, Andreas exclaimed, "A perfectly clear aura." Carefully observing Vivien, Andreas concluded that she didn't lose her mind and gave a gentle smile as he thought to himself how just when he thought he had finally caught up with her, she was one step ahead of him again and called out Vivien. Vivien, who was fully focused on her training, quickly turned back after hearing her name and was shocked to see it was none other than Andreas. Andreas told that he was looking for him, which shocked Vivien even more as she started to get even more nervous and quickly turned backwards, telling wait, for she was all ragged up at the moment while Andreas was slowly making his way towards her and asked what further questioning if she was good, which made Vivien blush nervously as she started to sweat rigorously. Trying to wipe the sweat off of her face, she warned Andreas not to come near for she smelled as well. Excusing himself, Andreas wrapped his hands around Vivien, who was left in a state of surprise as she froze nervously, not being able to move a muscle. She started to blush and sweat even more heavily as she tried to comprehend what Andreas was doing. "All right, done," said Andreas as he claimed it suited her perfectly as he expected. Looking down, Vivien was amused as she had not expected Andreas to bring a gift for her and asked a necklace and questioned why he gave it to her. Andreas questioned back why with a sense of surprise and soon told it was to thank her for helping him so many times. He further said that he got it on the top floor of the tower, can supposedly help one calm their mind, and he thought he would give it to her. Hearing that, Vivien started to bite her lips hard as she tried to contain her emotions. Squinting his eyes, Andreas addressed Vivien, which startled Vivien as she hurriedly questioned back with a yes. Andreas told she didn't look good and took out a potion, requesting Vivien to drink that potion and get some rest. Abruptly, Vivien turned back and started to run off as she yelled later, Andreas, while Andreas, holding the potion on his hand, was left in a state of confusion as he tried to comprehend what was happening and if he did something wrong. Watching Vivien leave, he questioned himself if that necklace did really have any effect and addressed that old geezer Madras, as he questioned himself if he was lying about it. Later, Andreas went to his personal laboratory and called out status window. Abruptly, a stats window appeared before him stating achievements. One was recognized by Madras and asked if he wished to accept the rewards. Andreas accepted it, and suddenly another window popped up stating a random magic-related talent will be awarded. Simultaneously, another window popped before him stating unusual power detected. Andreas was left in a state of shock as to what he was witnessing before him in the status window, which stated a talent, magic firepower, light element, a genius rank had been acquired. With his hand resting on his chin, he stared into the status window asking himself genius, for he had not learned light magic yet, so it was just a decoration for now. Summoning a green aura on the palm of his hand, he told how he would just have to learn it gradually and open a portal out of which Nickel arrived with the Fairy Queen's corpse in his hand. Andreas ordered Nickel to put it in the middle of the magic circle. Nickel did what Andreas asked and placed it in the middle of the magic circle while Andreas, in the back of his mind, was thinking how a corpse he had left lying around for half a year, thinking he would be able to use it once he had become more proficient in black magic. With a determined look on his face, he thought to himself how in theory, at his current level of proficiency, he should be able to do it and gazed towards the Fairy Queen's corpse that was lying in the middle of the magic circle and claimed he would definitely awaken it, the previous Fairy Queen Milline. While the awakening of the Fairy Queen was taking place, there was bang from inside of Andreas's dormitory, which left a bit of smoke coming out. Andreas was coughing and trying to catch his breath while the smoke covered his entire room. Andreas was shocked by the intensity of the shockwave. While he was still coughing, he quickly glanced at the awakening circle to see how the awakening turned out. Suddenly, a system notification popped up stating that a shadow banshee of legendary tier had been summoned. The Fairy Queen Milline finally rose from the smoke, which left Andreas in a state of joy as he stated how the awakening had worked. Another system notification popped up stating how the level of the finished corpse was high. It also gained a status bonus. The Fairy Queen was emitting an immense aura around her. Another system notification stated how the level of the finished corpse was extremely high. With its increased tier, it was now a shadow fairy banshee. Andreas was still in awe witnessing the Fairy Queen as his new summoning. But another system notification popped up right after stating how the level of the finished corpse was transcendently high, and it also regained a certain amount of its ego before death. Reading this notification left Andreas in a state of shock as he worriedly uttered the word transcendently. After some time at the port city Muriel, there was a shipboard restaurant which was named the Blessing of the Sea, where the head of the Morhaime family, Minius Morhaime, and Andreas were both having lunch together. Minius then told Andreas to eat as much as he liked. She further stated how she wanted to have a nice long talk with him, so she reserved the whole ship for them, and since it was hers, he didn't have to be shy. Taking a sip of wine from her glass, she told him if there was anything he wanted to talk about, he should speak freely about it. Then Andreas in a respectful manner replied how he should be the one to invite her as an apology for his rudeness, so he told her that he was sorry that she had to invite him like this. With confidence in her eyes, she told Andreas that he was her future husband, so there was no need to apologize like that on their first date, but hearing this left Andreas puzzled as he worriedly asked if she really meant that. Looking at his expression, Minas laughed and quickly told him that she was only joking, and there was no need for him to be so bewildered. But Andreas thought to himself how that didn't sound like a joke at all. Looking at her carefully, Andreas continued thinking how she was the kind of person who would stop at nothing to achieve her ambitions, and the Morhaime house had risen to power by doing the dirty work and taking mercenary jobs that other noble houses wouldn't. Suddenly, Minas with a stern voice asked Andreas if he made up his mind yet. She then stated how she knew she told him to take his time, but she was not really a patient person. Hearing what she just said brought a sudden change in his expression as he stated how he wanted to have her answer sooner. Then, Andreas in a calm way told her that he would like her to give him a little more time, and that was his reply to the question. He continued stating how his house was a fallen one, so there were a lot of things he had to do before he graduated. Hearing him say a lot of things made her curious, so she quickly stated that she understood the situation. After all, the Cromwell house was hated by the emperor for no reason. But then Andreas told her how he didn't believe the punishment given by His Majesty was unwarranted, to which Minas immediately replied how anyone could see that it was clearly unwarranted, and yet his was calm about the whole thing. Breaking a piece of bread into two, she firmly asked Andreas why he was so hesitant about forming an alliance with her. As soon as she asked this question, there was a minute of silence in the room as they kept on having their lunch. Then Andreas questioned himself how much should he tell her, and further wondered that she was a person who thought in terms of profit and loss, and depending on the situation, she might sell him out. Suddenly, Minas broke the silence and told him that he was a cautious boy by nature, further stating how he doesn't have to worry about anything, because even a rat couldn't speak up there without her permission. Then, with a smile on her face, she asked him if he was still hesitating, because he didn't trust her. Then does he want her to insult that white pig emperor? Listening to what she just said made Andreas throw the food he was eating, as he did not expect her to say this. Andreas then cleaned his mouth with a cloth and told her how what she just said was out of the blue, but Minas confidently asked him if he was ready to talk now, and further stated that he wanted to. She could even get him a written statement. Listening to this brought a look of confusion in Andreas as he told her if she was willing to go that far, then he had no choice but to talk. Andreas continued stating how the Majesty wishes to crush the Cromwell, so that was why he must build his power and foundations at all costs. Hearing this made her quickly replied how if he wanted to do this, then he should be joining hands with him immediately. Then Andreas stated how if he did that, one problem would arise, to which Minas asked him if he was saying that his power would become too big. With a serious look on his face, he replied that she was correct, and that it was because the Cromwells were nothing but a speck of dust that they were safe then. Minas then asked him if the emperor would start to curb him again if he gained power. Andreas, taking a sip from the glass, stated that she was right, and also mentioned how the Morhaimes could end up in the emperor's crosshairs as well. But at the same time, Andreas thought to himself what was her real motive for wanting him, was as she was even risking becoming a renegade. Then Minas finally told him how she was planning on having a child born of his tremendously gifted blood and also making him the next head of the family, but it turned out to be a poisoned chalice. Listening to her motive made Andreas wonder how the Morhaime family had strong political power, vast financial resources, and a powerful mercenary army, but they had never had an aura master or a warlock from their direct lineage. But Minas was still thinking about the emperor and the Cromwell family, as she told him that she had always wondered about the reason the emperor was so intent on destroying the Cromwell house. Then Andreas started to think to himself how he had got to show his hand somewhat and earn her trust too. Even if they didn't form an alliance, it was better to have a friendly relationship with House Morhaime. Abruptly, Andreas started talking about his father as he told her how his father, Count Cain Cromwell, fell victim to the emperor's ambitions, to which Minas, being the curious one, asked what his ambitions were. Andreas then stated how the emperor wanted to create an age of gods and rule the world as an absolute monarch, and the only way he could do that was by collecting the greatest treasure of all, the deadly sins. With determination in his eyes, he continued stating that he must stop the emperor by any means necessary, and that was his duty as the heir of the Cromwell house. But Minas questioned him if the revenge was for the Cromwells, or it was rather for his father. Then Andreas continued stating how both were true, but the emperor's ambitions were far more dangerous and could shake the whole world. Minas quickly replied how she got the gist of it, And she also heard how the Emperor was bloodthirstily searching for something in the north, but listening to this brought a surprised look on Andreas's face. He started to wonder that it was sons of the barbarians kidnapped by Bloody Dan, and he guessed how just getting rid of the spies wouldn't change history. He continued wondering how in the game there was no mention of who Dan's employer was, but now he knew it was none other than the Emperor himself. But as he was thinking this, Minas abruptly asked him what it was, as he looked like he knew something about the thing in north. Then, without any hesitation, Andreas finally told her that soon there will likely be a war with the north, but hearing this brought no change in her expression. Instead of getting worried, she casually ate a piece of meat and told him how he sounded like a prophet. But Andreas continued explaining to her that if you provoke the feuding tribal chieftains, then a justification for war could be created. Andreas told her it was fitting if she considered how the Emperor does things, to which Minas agreed to him and said that it was something that the pig would really do. Andreas further stated how once the unexpected war was over, the nobles and feudal lords who were unprepared for the war would be in a panic, while great changes would take place, but if they were well prepared, they would still be able to maintain a strong post-war position. Hearing what Andreas just said brought a smile on her face as she asked him if she should stock up on supplies in case of war, to which Andreas immediately replied, yes. She then stated how that was quite a generous head-ups, but only if things turned out as he expected. Andreas asked her if she was sure that was enough, but Minas then glanced at the pig and stated how by the time, the pig's in the center of this, made weak by tyranny. And with a terrifying look on her face, she further stated that if it was weakened by tyranny, then it would be ready to be taken. Meanwhile, at the Imperial Palace, one person was kneeling in front of the Emperor as he was greeting him with all the respect. Then the Emperor, being the arrogant one, sternly asked the person what interesting stories does he have this time. The person who was kneeling down was the Duke Hector Kazaf, who was the Prime Minister of the Rodland Empire. He started stating how Andreas Cromwell, the son of Cain Cromwell, had conquered the 30th floor of the Madras Tower, and also how Minas Morhaime had tried to make an alliance with the Cromwell house, which he had not responded to. The Prime Minister, in a worried manner, stated that this was just an outward gesture, as they didn't know what they were up to behind the scenes. But the Emperor, with a furious look, sternly asked him what was so frightening about that punk, and why was he so frightened of him. Listening to the Emperor get mad immediately made the Prime Minister apologize to him, but the Emperor then told him to report to him about the people he sent to the north, to which the Prime Minister replied that they were doing their best, but they haven't found anything yet. The Emperor, with a serious look, told him how they work harder, now further stating that Lord Jester said he found something to do with the deadly sins in the north. Hearing the Emperor brought a terrified look on his face, but he replied that they would definitely find it. In the meantime, in the middle of a heavy snowfall, a luxurious carriage was moving at an incredible pace. The person inside the carriage was none other than Jester himself. He was carefully looking at the picture as he stated that to get the Wraith, they had to fight the Great Chief. He was looking at the picture of a small child and stated that it would be a troublesome task to get the Wraith. Suddenly, a magical device near Jester started beeping continuously, which made him glance at it in confusion. A voice of a girl could be heard stating how it had been a while, but Jester immediately recognized her voice as it was Luna herself. Then Luna, with an excited tone, stated how she knew who was the one to kill Kyler. Without wasting any time, Jester asked her who it was. She quickly replied that it was Andreas Cromwell. Luna was in the exact place where the fight had taken place as she was jumping in excitement. Luna continued stating how she was sure that Andreas was the one to do it. Luna then, with a took of excitement, asked Jester if she could turn Andreas Cromwell into Luna's toy. A calm and gentle voice came from Lady Minas' ship, speaking softly. "If you'll excuse me now." Andreas stepped down the stairs from the ship, his mind racing. He had a feeling that chaos was about to erupt, but a part of him saw an opportunity. If I can keep an eye on the Emperor's moves through Minas, it could be a huge advantage in the future, he thought. For now, though, one thing was clear: he had to grow stronger. No matter what, his talent for black magic needed to evolve further. His first plan was to dive deep into studying Morn's and Kyler's black magic books. Then, when the Academy holidays arrived, he would finally get his hands on the Red Dragon Krabma. A week passed, and the holidays finally began at Rodland Academy. At the same time, a voice echoed through the train station's announcement system. "The train to Grandest Kingdom will depart in 10 minutes. Please make sure you don't miss your train." Andreas stood on the platform, ready to leave. His goal was clear. He was heading out to begin his hunt for the Red Dragon Krabma. Determination filled his every step as he prepared for the journey ahead. As Andreas waited for the train, His thoughts turned to the map he had obtained at the Muriel auction. It showed that Krav Maha's dragon tomb was hidden deep within the Biotra Great Forest. Thankfully, the grandest kingdom, which bordered the forest, was just a train ride away. However, beyond that point, the journey would have to continue either on foot or horseback. The forest itself was an entirely different world, a place untouched by the Empire's customs and laws. I just hope nothing gets out of control out there, Andreas thought, already anticipating the challenges that lay ahead. As Andreas made his way toward the train, he suddenly felt a light poke on his back. Startled, he turned around to see who it was. It was none other than Vivien. Surprised, Andreas stared at her and called out her name, Vivien. With a slight blush on her cheeks, Vivien gave him a gentle smile and greeted him softly. "Hello, Andreas." They began talking as Andreas greeted her back. "Hello. Are you traveling somewhere too, Vivien?" She nodded with a warm smile and replied, "I'm heading back to my hometown." "Your hometown?" Andreas asked, surprised. "That's sudden." Vivien adjusted the luggage in her hand and nodded. "Yes, my father asked me to come home," she explained. Andreas responded softly, "Will you be all right? I thought you weren't very comfortable at home." With a hesitant look, Vivien admitted, "I don't want to go. I'd rather spend more time with you, Andreas." Andreas looked at her in surprise. "Huh? With me?" he asked, stunned. Inside, his thoughts raced. What should I do? It'll be a problem if she decides to come with me now. Suddenly, interrupting his thoughts, Vivien spoke softly. "But that's exactly why I need to go back to my hometown." Andreas paused for a moment, a mix of amazement and relief flashing across his face. Andreas closed his eyes, feeling a sense of relief, before replying, "I see. Have a safe trip, Vivien." But inside, he couldn't help but think to himself, it seems even she doesn't always need the help of a fairy. Suddenly, Vivien said, "All right then, I'll be going now. See you after the holidays." Andreas replied, "Yes, take care." But deep down, he thought, it seems like the time for Vivien to stand on her own has come as well, and both of them left for their own destination. Somewhere in the hills, the sun began to set, casting an orange hue across the sky as the rays of the fading sunlight painted everything in warm colors. The train came to a stop at the station, and Andreas stepped off, making his way into the bustling castle town of Grandest Kingdom. As Andreas wandered through the town, a strange feeling tugged at him. "It's my first time here in person," he thought, "but it feels strangely familiar. Maybe it's because I visited so often in the game." Still, he couldn't help but wonder, why is it so hectic here? As Andreas walked through the town, he overheard a conversation between two people. One of them sighed and said, "I never thought things would turn out like this in just a few days." The other replied, "The orcs are causing chaos in the forest, and because of that, our business is suffering." Andreas looked at the two people, his face growing serious as a bead of sweat appeared on his cheeks. "Orcs?" he thought, a sense of unease creeping over him. "This doesn't feel right. I need to learn more." With that, he continued on his way, his mind focused on the strange situation. After walking a little further, Andreas spotted an inn called the Grandest Hotel. He walked up to the gate, placed a coin on the counter, and asked for a room and a meal. The maid at the counter handed Andreas a key and said, "You can have the last room on the second floor." As he took the key, Andreas asked her quietly, "Is something going on? The town feels pretty hectic." The maid began to pour a drink for Andreas and explained, "Oh, I guess a traveler like you wouldn't know. Things are going badly near the border." Andreas sat down at the bar, listening to her as he waited for his drink. The maid turned back, her face filled with fear, and said, "For the first time in 40 years, they say an orc lord has appeared in the Great Forest." Suddenly, Andreas began to picture the orc lord in his mind, his thoughts growing darker. "That's bad news," he thought. "An orc lord's appearance means the orc tribes in the Great Forest are uniting. Just finding the tomb in that forest will be hard enough, but with a whole group of orcs appearing?" Andreas quietly asked the maid, "Could it be that the road leading to the Great Forest is blocked?" The maid slammed the drink cup onto the table, replying sharply, "Isn't it obvious? Civilians aren't allowed anywhere near the forest anymore." Andreas, holding on to a glimmer of hope, asked again, "Civilians? Are you saying there's another way to get in?" The maid, while managing the plate, glanced back at Andreas and said, "Becoming a mercenary is one way, but I wouldn't recommend it." The maid added, her voice dripping with sarcasm, especially a scrawny guy like you. I mean, a slender guy like you would be cut in half by an orc." She quickly covered her mouth, realizing her words, then said in a quieter tone, "You're a man. You should put on some more weight." Andreas, sitting at the bar with his drink, felt a mix of awkwardness and irritation. The barmaid gave Andreas a strange look and said, "They're short on men and willing to offer rewards, so they might take you in." Andreas sighed and muttered, "What a pain," he continued. "Even though they're called mercenaries, they're still soldiers in the army, so their movements are restricted." Taking a sip from his cup, Andreas muttered, "Seems there's no other way." He thought to himself, "I guess it's better than not being able to go at all." It is what it is. Outside the hotel, the moon had risen, and the night was quiet, with the sky sparkling with beautiful stars. Andreas began making his way upstairs to his room, his thoughts drifting. I guess this is why the Everlast company couldn't get the ingredients for Slame's potion. He continued, "Anyway, tomorrow I'll stop by the Biotra fortification and register as a mercenary." As Andreas opened the door to his room, a voice suddenly came from behind. "Are you going to kill the Orc Lord?" It was Luna with his weapon hanging upside down, who was sent by Master Zester. Andreas was froze for a while with scared expression. Andreas glanced back to see who it was. Before he could react, Luna leaped down, landing in front of him. "I've been waiting for you to leave the academy," she said, her gaze sharp as she prepared to charge at him. With a graceful yet intense presence, Luna called out his name, Andreas, her voice clear and commanding. Andreas looked at her in surprise, his thoughts racing. "She's Lu." Before he could finish the thought, Luna suddenly vanished from where she stood, making her move to attack. With incredible speed, Luna appeared above Andreas, unleashing a powerful attack. Andreas amazed, his face frozen in terror and fear. Luna swung her weapon with immense force from above, her eyes glowing an eerie purple as a scared look flashed across her face. Andreas instinctively dodged, barely avoiding the strike. The sheer power of her attack left the ground trembling beneath them. The force of her powerful attack sent him stumbling backward, collapsing to the ground with his back. With quick, trembling steps, Luna moved toward Andreas and pressed her foot firmly on his chest. Hurt and struggling, Andreas lay on the ground, trying to free himself from her grip. Luna, her expression fierce and determined, raised her weapon high, its tip sharp like a bee's stinger. With a threatening shout, she warned, "This is going to sting a little." With all her strength, Luna launched the attack at Andreas, but he quickly raised a black magic shield to block it, stopping her strike in its tracks. Andreas, his face filled with fear, remained on the ground, holding up his black magic shield. Luna pushed relentlessly with her weapon, determined to strike him. Luna's eyes widened in surprise as she stared at the black magic shield. Her face showed a mix of confusion and amazement, unable to believe it had stopped her attack. Suddenly, Andreas unleashed a powerful black magic attack at Luna, forcing her to be pushed backward from the impact. Surrounded by a dark aura, Andreas stood ready to fight. Luna, surprised, stared at him and muttered, "Well, oh, that's Kyler's shadow magic, isn't it?" With a mix of amazement and a hint of a blush, Luna stared at him and said, "That's interesting. Did you kill Kyler and take his magic? How did you do that?" Andreas stared at her in surprise, his mind racing. "TSK. Even though I destroyed all the evidence at Kyler's hideout, it wouldn't matter with this girl. A spirit medium who can communicate with the dead. Luna Pendragon, Thieves' Madness." Luna stood tall, striking a confident pose with her weapon in hand. She looked at him and asked, "What's wrong?" "It's boring if you stay quiet forever." Andreas, preparing to fight as he drew his sword, thought to himself, "I'm so tired of these relentless groups." He then looked at her and asked, "You're here to kill me, aren't you?" Luna, with a thoughtful expression, replied, "Huh? Not really." Meanwhile, the black magic from the wall slowly crept toward her. Suddenly, she struck the black magic on the wall with her weapon. Andreas, his expression filled with irritation, muttered to himself, "This guy. She figured it out." Suddenly, Luna shouted at Andreas, "But Luna might just want to kill you." Her face flushed, and her tone carrying a teasing, almost moaning edge. Andreas, his face filled with fear, thought to himself, "I need to stay alert. She may seem like she's just playing, but she's already a warlock-class wizard at such a young age." He then asked her softly, "Why are you here?" Luna, letting go of her weapon, replied with a cheerful, "All right." Her expression brightened as she reached into her pocket and added, "All right." Suddenly, she pulled something out of her pocket and began speaking excitedly. "Jester. It's Luna." Her face lit up with happiness. Andreas, shocked, repeated the name in surprise. "Jester." A glowing box-like device used for communication lit up and spoke. That was quick. "Have you made contact with a target?" Luna responded cheerfully, "Yep. Luna is with him right now." The device spoke again. "Good. Let me talk to him directly." Luna nodded and replied, "Okay." Luna tossed the device toward Andreas and said, "Here, catch." Andreas caught it, his face filled with confusion. Andreas, looking both determined and shocked, stared at the device and said, "This is Andreas Cromwell." But deep down, he thought to himself, "What's going on? I thought they were here to kill me after finding out I killed Kyler." Jester suddenly said, "How dare you lay a hand on my agent? You've got guts, as always." Andreas, both irritated and fearful, thought to himself, "That's bold coming from someone who wants me dead." He then replied calmly, "My apologies. My teacher is gone, so I didn't know Sir Kyler was your agent." Jester replied through the device, "You're quite the smooth talker, but that doesn't excuse your actions." Andreas, his irritation growing, thought to himself, "So this is what they mean by being brazen-faced. I'd love to punch him right now, but I need to avoid a direct fight for now. I'll play dumb." He then replied, "I hate to admit that my actions often backfire, but since I'm partly at fault, I'll apologize. During the slot case, I was just trying to survive, and this time I truly had no idea." Jester, with a cold expression, said, "Since you acknowledge your mistake, I'll let it go for now." With black appearance and aura, Jester spoke again, his voice colder this time. "I won't say I don't have personal feelings against you, but as the director of the congregations, I must act in the best interest of our cause." Andreas, surprised by the words, stared at the device, his mind racing. What does he mean by that? He thought. As Andreas was trying to comprehend the meaning behind his words, Jester spoke again. "In any case, we need someone to keep us informed of developments in Rodland, the heart of the continent. However, for various reasons, I no longer have the resources to do so." Meanwhile, Luna leaned in to listen to what Jester was saying. Jester then said, "That's why I have a proposal for him," which made Andreas wary as he thought to himself, "This guy, he's speaking in a roundabout way, but in the end, he's trying to get him under his thumb." Jester then, without any delays, told Andreas, "Become a member of the Congregatio, Andreas Cromwell." Hearing this made Andreas utterly shocked as he had not expected Jester to say something like that.